This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Yael Barda.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage. That's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that was supposed to be called Israel Behind the Headlines, but the 7th of October events changed our plans like everybody else's, and this episode is one of a few that will focus on the current crisis in its broader context. To this end, we are pleased to welcome a leading historian of the Gaza Strip. Dotan Halevy is a Polonsky postdoctoral fellow at the Leer Jerusalem Institute. He is an environmental and social historian of the late Ottoman Empire and the modern Middle East, currently working on a book project entitled Stripped, Ruination, Peripherality, and the Making of the Gaza Strip, 1840 to 1950. Dr. Dotan Halevy, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Hi, Gilad. Hi, El. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So Gaza has become this icon, almost a metonymy of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is immediately recognizable around the world and contains a rich imagery among Israelis and Westerners. How did this tiny strip of land become so central?
Okay, so that's a huge question, of course, but we can maybe start with just the simple fact that the Gaza Strip, from its very creation, was a sort of crystallization of the Palestinian disaster of the Nakba.
You're talking about 1948.
That's correct.
That moment.
Exactly. The moment where the Palestinian refugee crisis was created. During the war, it's not exactly a moment, it's a period, of course. But maybe in comparison to other sites or places of the Palestinian diaspora, or the place where Palestinian refugees found refuge and shelter during and after the war, the Gaza Strip became the place where the density of refugees were the biggest. Their political status as a place that was hosted by actually no state made their situation severe, as well as the fact that the size of this territory is very small. And ever since, whatever the Palestinian people as a political collective is going through, Gaza maybe experienced these developments in the worst in the worst manner, and we can go into details further.
It's hard to imagine that, like you described, this central port city that's like a place of convening, a place of economic exchange, trade. It's so hard to imagine this isolated strip today in that way.
Right. So you're going into the historical period that I'm working on as a historian. So indeed, prior to 1948, there was no strip, right? The strip is a historical product of the 1948 war. In my research, I look at Gaza, the city, but also the region which surrounds the city of Gaza as a historical borderland, which means a space that's bridging bigger spaces, bigger environmental regions, economic regions, different populations of different cultures. And if we consider the locality, the geography of Gaza, we can see that the reason for this city's existence where it is because it historically bridged the region of Greater Syria, which is today Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, bridged this vast spaces to Sinai from the one side and the Arabian Peninsula from the other side. Gaza itself was a city of markets and a city of caravans and caravan trade. And that was this place's historical role. During a century between the mid-19th century to the mid-20th century, this borderland, this historic borderland, is going through several stages of transitions, which makes it turned from a bridge, from a gateway region into a periphery. If you like, this is the kind of prehistory of the Gaza Strip, which basically lays the ground or kind of prepare the conditions for the creation of the Gaza Strip in 1948. So it is hard to imagine, and it's hard to see today how Gaza is this central place, but partially out of historical consequences, it turns into the Gaza Strip turning from a periphery by the consequences of the war into this enclave, into this coastal enclave.
But even before 1948 and after that prehistory, I mean, let's talk about the Mandate period. It was still not a very central place in Palestine. I mean, the border, the shoreline area had much bigger concentrations, whether it's Jaffa or Haifa. And of course, the heartland of Palestine was away from Gaza. And I think a good testament of that is that area was almost entirely devoid of any Zionist settlement.
That's perfectly correct. Let's just put the chronology right. So when we're talking about the Strip, not about Gaza, but about the Gaza Strip, we're talking from 1948 onwards. During the Mandate period, Gaza was still a city and a district. And part of the process that I'm trying to put my finger on in my research is this process of peripheralization, a place turning into a periphery, which includes also the Mandate period. Partially, not solely, but partly also because Gaza and the Gaza region are being demolished, destroyed during the First World War. So when we think about the Mandate period, Gaza is often external to the story of the development of Palestinian national consciousness, the development of the conflict, and also is outside the story of kind of Zionist imagination of and spread of settlement in Palestine. So indeed, as you say, the Mandate period is also part of this long process of becoming a periphery.
How central is the story of Gaza's destruction during the First World War? Was it because it was really this borderline area, as you talk about, the clashes between the two warring parties, the Ottomans and the British?
That's correct. So part of the dynamic that borderlands are going through in history, if we want to think about kind of historic borderlands across the globe, is that they can sort of put on different personas as circumstances change, right? So under this reality, hundreds of years of Ottoman rule and even before Islamic rule in this region, so we can see that Gaza is a borderland between different geographical regions, therefore serving as a gateway, right? Moving from the pastoral areas to the desert, from the sown, from the agricultural lands into the pastoral areas. But into the high imperial age, so-called, in the late 19th century, when Britain is taking over Egypt in 1882, and the Ottomans are kind of trying to increasingly project their sovereignty over their periphery provinces. This clash is starting to be formed exactly in these places that were previously a bridge, right? This is also a process that is accompanied by the introduction of steamships and railways that supply different pathways that were once had to go through the land and can now move through water. The opening of the Suez Canal is part of this process, of course. Paving the Hijaz Railway is another. And then places that were once a place of encounter and meeting are becoming little by little a place of imperial clash. And this is basically what Gaza is going through, first with a global crisis where Britain and the Ottoman Empire are struggling over sovereignty in the edges of Sinai around the city of Aqaba, resulting in the separation line, later international border of 1906 between Rafah and Aqaba, today the southern borders of Israel. And later, during World War I, where there's already a border established, and now around this border, around the city of Gaza, the Ottomans are forming a defense line. And this defense line holds for almost a year when the British are invading from Egypt through Sinai towards Greater Syria. So Gaza is a kind of a player that sits on this edge, seeing all these developments, and also, of course, being affected by them.
It's so funny. I think I wonder also for our listeners, right? I mean, it's so much part of our daily life here ever since October 7th and all the days since then with the military's response on Gaza, and it's kind of there's this idea that, I mean, it kind of sheds light on something that I've always been curious about, which is, even in political negotiations, it would seem almost that Gaza was on the moon, is like far away from the eye, not internalized as a part of what is to be negotiated, be it two states or any type of solution. Then, and in a way, this history that you tell really sheds a longer durée of this way of seeing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation, because I think Gaza is serving in this sort of dual role. Indeed, even until the 7th of October, it is considered as a sort of a supplement or as a side, whatever will be whatever will be the developments between Israel and the Palestinians, Gaza would be a part of it as well, right? If for the last decade and a half, the policy is conflict management policy, so Gaza is also being embedded into this. The same for going back in settlement processes, even going back to autonomy plan by Begin in the Camp David Accords, right? So the autonomy is for the Palestinians, but of course the heartland, when Israel thinks about the Palestinians, is in the West Bank. At the same time, Gaza is the laboratory for implementing these settlements, right? This is where Gaza first comes, right? In Hebrew, Azat Chila. Azat Chila starts from the autonomy plan. It is being, of course, it is being shoved under the table before the first war, the 1982 Lebanon War, and then being revived again in the Oslo Accords, right? Of course, the formation of the PA and the Oslo Accords and the division to A, B, and C territories are kind of modeled on the West Bank, but the laboratory would be Gaza again, right? So the PA, when the PA arrives, it is being forced on Gaza first as a sort of an experience, Gaza and Jericho and Jericho. So it's interesting how it's outside our perception, but it represents the first dynamics. Also, I think in Palestinian politics, I mean, you can see that along the periods, Palestinian political leaders came from Gaza, right? Starting with Yasser Arafat and other Fatah leaders, later PLO, and as well, of course, for Hamas, which was Hamas is kind of made in Gaza, and as well as with uprisings. I mean, if you think about the First Intifada started from Jabalia, right? I mean, while Israel is kind of concentrated on what's going on in the heartland, in the West Bank, the Intifada is stemming from Jabalia, as well as other developments, the second file later. I mean, just thinking.
And also the first uprising after 1967. When was it? In 1971.
1971, correct.
Yeah.
Yes, the first place where the PLO can kind of form a basis for resistance.
So in a way, as you say, Gaza is really the quintessential, Palestinian laboratory. And what you said in the beginning, in response to my first question, and it's also apparent in your writing, that in a way the history of Gaza made it possible to become this quintessential laboratory of the Palestinian question. This tiny piece of land harboring today more than 2 million Palestinians. It's really, the opposite of or maybe it is not the opposite. It's the Zionist logic of having as many Arabs in the smallest area possible. And I would like you to ask you to elaborate a bit on the historical contingency that, as you say, somewhat lent itself to Gaza becoming what it is.
Okay, again, that's of course a huge question. I can say this. Indeed, for Israel, trying to bypass the reality in which there is a place where Palestinian refugees and their descendants are concentrated in a manner that cannot be ignored. I mean, this had been an ongoing kind of nag or problem for Israeli policy. Right? And Israel tried in various ways to deal with this problem. Because when you have a refugee society spread in the vast areas of southern Lebanon or in Syria or in the West Bank or in Jordan, right? This is one thing. But when you have the Nakba as in its concentrated form, right? In one place, bordering Israel. So I mean, this is something that keeps returning the Israeli-Palestinian conflict into 1948, right? And whatever Israel has been doing in order to deal with this problem only exacerbated it, right? And only kind of when Israel was trying to find from an Israeli perspective solutions to this, it only made things worse.
You're talking about the disengagement or not? Just?
So I'm talking about far before the disengagement. The disengagement is a very recent manifestation of this, and of course, I mean the policy of okay, so let's just disengage, and we can put a fence, and we can put a barrier, and we can securitize the strip as if we. And we put it under a shutter that we won't have to deal with anyone out behind it. I mean, this is of course had been a mirage. But even before the disengagement, I'm talking about Israel trying after 1967 to encourage quote unquote migration from the strip, right? Bringing about this wave of guerrilla that we talked about earlier in 1971, 1972. Afterwards, Israel would try to resettle the refugees in these new neighborhoods, basically causing destruction of parts of the refugee camps. And Israel was trying to convince that if refugees can be resettled in new dwelling areas or like residential areas that Israel had been building during the 1970s and 80s, the refugees would actually give up their claim for refugeehood and for return, right? That was part of the conditions. Refugees would leave the refugee camps. They would destroy with their own hands the houses that they were dwelling in thus far, and would give up their identity as refugees. Of course, this had never happened. And of course, I mean, I think maybe the project with the most long-lasting endurance is the economic integration of the Gaza Strip into Israel, basically making the Gaza Strip into a reservoir of labor force to work in construction, agriculture, industry in Israel during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, right? Making the Gaza Strip into a dependent economy, right? In order to try to elevate life condition, which it indeed worked. I mean, people had more prosperity, but at the same time, they could not have economic development.
But is all this separate from Israel's policy towards the Palestinians in general, also the West Bank? How is Gaza unique in this sense?
So, I mean, that's interesting because indeed, I mean, some of these policies were also implemented more widely. But since the problem in the Gaza Strip is the most severe, I mean, both the effect, is felt in like it is felt in no other place, and the consequences are different from the West Bank. I mean, you can look at the results. So the rise of Hamas, for instance, is a result of Israeli policies within the Gaza Strip, right? Being a place where Muslim Brotherhood activities and worldview can take hold in the refugee camps and under strict Israeli military rule. So it's I have in my apartment I have a cooking book which is called, I think it became very popular in the States. It's called the Gaza Kitchen book. It was once very popular, like very beautiful book with beautiful pictures. And in the introduction, they say that, in fact, recipes for Gazan cuisine is very similar to the general Palestinian cuisine, only that it had much more hot pepper, right? Everything is much hotter, right? And indeed, that's a good metaphor for things that we see along Palestinian history in the Gaza Strip. And as I said, some things are really experimented first in Gaza. If you think about the civil administration was formed in Gaza first, right? I mean, Yael knows this better than me. 1981 and 1982 in all the other territories.
So the economic difference, that marginalization of the Strip as a periphery, is also an economic one. So from the sources and possibilities for development, and this is already. So you're claiming this is much earlier than we would think, but also the environmental changes and the kind of change in terrain of the Mediterranean and all that. So if you could just say a little bit about that aspect of your work.
Okay, so here maybe we can again sort of divide between pre-1948 to post-1948. Gaza's peripheralization in economic terms, which is, I mean, this is under the category that historians refer to as world system theory, right? I mean, the idea that industrialization in Europe and North America was creating from I think 18th century to the 19th century. But this theory is also applied for earlier centuries, but basically creating global peripheries. The role of the peripheries is to supply raw materials for the industries. And by so doing, the core areas which are industrialized prevent economic development from the peripheries. In the case of Gaza, a very interesting phenomena developed in which Gaza, as I said earlier, was a gateway connected to vast regions very far away from Gaza itself, right? The Arabian Peninsula is quite far, as well as Egypt, as well as Greater Syria. And Gaza, as a gateway city, was connected to the economy of the Hajj, the annual Muslim pilgrim to Mecca and Medina, which is a recurring event that the entire economic system of any Islamic polity in the region should take care of, meaning mobilizing different cities in different places in order to take part of the Hajj. The Hajj in pre-modern period is not an event of a month. It's not an event of 2 months. It's a year-round event, because if you want to have supply for the Hajj caravans, you need to sow the wheat and barley in advance, right? I mean, so this is a recurring event. So Gaza was part of this vast geographic economy which supplied this city a sort of a very solid basis for existence. So even if there were sometimes arid periods, right, of drought, still, I mean, this was happening every year. With modern trade, maritime trade in the Mediterranean, Gaza is slowly shifting its economy towards export mostly of grains, specifically of barley, because on the edge of the desert, barley is the type of grain that grows most effectively. And actually, the producers of this grain were nomad or semi-nomad tribal confederacies in the area of Gaza and what is today the Negev. But it turned into this export to the export economy as a global periphery. And thus, once other markets were found in different places, for instance, in the case of Gaza was producing barley, and it was mostly exporting barley for the brewing industry in the British Isles. But once drought hit the region for several years in the beginning of the 20th century, buyers could easily find other markets, specifically the barley that is most reminiscent for the types from the Mediterranean came from California, which was a huge industry, right? So into the 19th century, Gaza had lost its role as a supplier of barley, thus basically losing its economic basis. Gaza was not tied to its kind of very specific environmental hinterland before. It was actually tied to much vaster geographies, but it was modernity that actually created this environmental vulnerability, right? So this is where I think the environmental perspective is useful, not to think about kind of abstract environment and abstract climate or whatever, but to think about environmental vulnerabilities. And how these are economically and socially constructed, making places, allowing places to collapse in face of events like droughts. And this is all, I think. I mean, the kind of this structure is also relevant for the modern Gaza Strip, which is a completely artificial territory that has no environmental, no climatic, no geographical resources to support itself. Recently, there was a report about kind of warning the region in Israel from climate change effects in the Gaza Strip, which warned from water scarcity, of course, and sea level rise, and many other things, and droughts, of course. But ignoring the idea that Gaza is an enclave, besieged from all sides, right, of overpopulated, which all of these are political conditions. These are not environmental conditions. These are not natural conditions, right? And if you're not addressing these conditions first, I mean, you can address these first in order to kind of to prevent all different environmental risks. So for me, I mean, as an environmental historian, this comes first before the kind of abstract environment.
Environmental and social historian. So we're talking about the place that Gaza Strip holds, or Gaza, in the Israeli imagination, in the imperial imagination, both Ottoman and British. What about the Palestinians themselves? I mean, it is sort of a convention that, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are sort of part of the same national unit. Everyone's talking about a two-state solution, whenever that happens, a Palestinian state within these borders. And I'm asking you also, to employ your historian's perspective and maybe comment on to what extent this separation between Gaza and the rest of the Palestinian territories, even before 1948, as you said, this creeping peripheralization of Gaza that long predated the Nakba, is it reversible at all? Or, to what extent Gaza and the rest of Palestine are two separate units today?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, and also a tricky one. I mean, because talking as an Israeli, I need to be careful here. But I can say that you can sense.
Everybody needs to be careful.
Yes,
especially these days. Yeah.
So let me talk about history, where I'm on a safer
more
ground.
Comfortable.
Yeah, more comfortable. So in 1943, the district officer, or the Kaimakam of Gaza. His name was Arif el-Arif, right? He's a well-known Palestinian historian and author, man of letters. He wrote a book called Ta'arikh Gaza, The History of Gaza. And in the final chapter of this book, he talks about the current city, and he gives a kind of a subchapter that is called The Characteristics of the People of Gaza. Now, this is basically a list of insults, right, about the people of the city and its region, about their habits, about their manners, about how they look, about how they talk, what they eat, what they wear. Several months after this was published, another book was published, which is called The History of Gaza, Critique and Corrections. This was published by two Gazans, and basically saying, you come from a Jerusalemite family. You were brought upon us as a district officer by the British, and you know nothing about this city and about its people, and they kind of point to different places throughout the book where it seems to be that Arif el-Arif is only kind of elevating people whom he knew, and some of these were his relatives, while saying, I mean, we can kind of reply to any kind of accusation that you. Now, the funny thing is that I think, I mean, from my reading, that Arif el-Arif was not trying to be, he wasn't trying to insult anyone. He was actually thinking that his mission as a Palestinian, as someone who can write books and publish them, is to introduce Gaza to the rest of the Palestinian people, right? He was actually thinking that he was doing service, because otherwise he wouldn't have published this, right? Now, you can learn two things from this. First, I mean, and here I'm following my advisor's, I mean, already kind of classic book, Palestinian Identity, where he says, I mean, identity is a layered construction. I mean, you can identify yourself with your family, with your city, with your nation, with your, I mean, and these are not contradictory, but complementary, right? So I think in kind of Arif el-Arif's mind, he says, I mean, first, this is a Palestinian project I produce here. I mean, just think of Palestinians during the mandate period. They need to deal with the huge amounts of papers and writings that Zionists are producing, creating all this stuffness of their project, of their national projects. Palestinians must deal with this in the same manner. So here you have a Palestinian intellectual basically writing a book about the history of this place, right? This is massive. This is a book going back to biblical times. This is a massive project, very, I mean, surely important for Palestinian identity and for Palestinian national consciousness, right? At the same time, he wants to be sort of, he wants to introduce to the people of Nablus or to Khalil, right, to Nablus or Hebron or Jerusalem. I mean, who are the Gazans? Assuming that people from Jerusalem have never been in Gaza in their lives, right? Or that people, I mean, in northern Palestine, they don't know Gazans probably. And he says, I mean, I've been here for 3 years as a Kaimakam, so let me tell you about these people.
So, like district commissioner, Kaimakam.
Exactly, yeah. A district, I think at the time it was called district officer. I'm not sure. I think the commissioner was always British, and the officer was a local Palestinian, if I'm not mistaken. So indeed, I mean, you can see in historical materials that, of course, these separations exist. No doubt that the creation of the strip made it worse. At the same time, we must remember that the strip was, in fact, a replica of wider Palestine, because the refugees themselves came from the coastal strip, from Jaffa southwards. So what it brings to this region is a much more sort of thicker, more richer Palestinian identity of people coming from many, many places. And there are accounts, historian and sociologist Salim Tamari wrote about how refugees are coming into Gaza, but they are not familiar with the local costumes. I mean, because in the area of Gaza, there were specific places for veneration, ziyarah, specific ceremonies. But people coming from Jaffa, they knew something else, right? They were celebrating, for instance, Nebi Rubin, the annual pilgrimage celebration south of Jaffa. But in Gaza, they were celebrating something else. So the Gaza Strip was a concentration of many different traditions from southern Palestine, which made it different.
But basically, you're saying that what we assume to be the rule now of Gaza and the West Bank parting ways, maybe not entirely, but going in different directions, is something that started way before the current separation between the two, whether it was 1967 or 2005 or what have you.
I mean, yes. At the same time, I would say that it has no significance for anything that Israel is planning to do, or, I mean, it's not a justification or an excuse for separating these two territories, which sometimes I hear. No, these are different people. These are people of the coast. These are people of the mountains. I mean, who cares?
Yeah.
Right?
No,
this is not for Israel to decide.
Also, legally, according to international law, I mean, it is still the same national unit. So this really, culture is irrelevant.
Exactly.
But what I think is, and it's interesting because everything is so volatile right now. We're in the middle of this. We're recording this in the middle of a major war. The truce has ended. We're 2 days into, back into it, and with devastating consequences. And I think that it's just really important to have knowledge, to know of these histories, and to have this different and broader view that I think so many times are not at all in conversation. This knowledge isn't in conversation at all. And I mean, this happens to us a lot, right? In this podcast, that all these things that are super relevant and no one talks about. But
that's why we exist. Yeah, that's why we exist.
No, but here you're doing something which I find really illuminating and interesting and opening and eye-opening for anyone who's trying to think of the future. So how we do have to know things about the present, but also the past.
Maybe one last question before we wrap up about really the prevalence of religious extremism, specifically in Gaza, and Hamas being the latest and perhaps most brutal iteration thereof. But it's also been this truism that Gaza has been this hotbed of radical Islamism as opposed to elsewhere in Palestine. Do you see a historical reason? I mean, what are really the root causes of the fact that Hamas emerged in Gaza?
The reason for the success of Hamas, I mean, taking it back to the Muslim Brotherhood would be difficult. But I think that for Hamas kind of becoming popular, there were the conditions of actually necessity in Gaza. We must remember that Hamas started as a more something reminiscent of a welfare society than a militant group called Al-Mujamma al-Islami in the beginning of the 70s. This is where sometimes the claim that it was encouraged by Israel or supported by Israel come from, because Israel indeed wanted to cultivate this group as a counter force to Fatah and for the secular religious groups, because during under the
secular political groups.
I'm sorry?
You mean secular political groups? Secular
political groups, of course, because in the Cold War, extremism or radicalism was in the left, right?
Yeah.
It was not in religion, but it became so. And Hamas had the fertile ground for these groups to develop and to represent them. And also, I mean, this goes back to the point where I already said that the people who founded Hamas were from the Gaza Strip. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin he was a refugee from Jura, today Ashkelon. Haniyeh, Rantisi, all these figures were either born in the Gaza Strip or with refugees themselves. But we said earlier that Gaza was served always served as kind of first place for experiments, right? So if we said that the Oslo settlement was first implemented in the Gaza Strip, so it was also the first where Hamas could position itself as an effective opposition to the Oslo mechanism, right? So you can also have this. I mean, if the PA is implemented there, Hamas also becoming more politically effective and vocal there, right? As of course going all the way to the place where Hamas became a political ruling group, right? A place where it has this kind of very, very limited sovereignty, but it had a place to become from a militant group into a functioning government, right? In the last 16 years. But Gad, I'm not sure that is the message that I want to close with. So,
I will ask you. I mean, historians really hate to talk about the present and the future.
Yeah.
So, but
there's a lot to hate about this present.
Yeah. But I will push you nonetheless and ask you. I mean, Gaza has had its share of misery. I mean, it's also been a breeding ground for failures, political failures of any kind. Just pick one. Is this really the trajectory, an irreversible trajectory? Can things in any way become better for Gaza and by implication for the broader region?
So of course it can. And I think that one of the things that history in this case teach us is that there is a Gaza, right, which is not the Gaza Strip. There is Gaza before the Gaza Strip, and there was also, and there still is Gaza, which is beyond the Strip, right? If you think about half of the population of the Gaza Strip today, which are below the age of 18. These are people that are physically caged in this territory, but at the same time, there are the generation that grew into TikTok and into Facebook and into Twitter, and they are well connected to the world. And I mean, the evidence is the direct testimonies that we get every day from the war, right? So there is Gaza, which is beyond the Strip, but I think that also physically Gaza can return to being Gaza and not the Gaza Strip. This requires a political settlement. This requires kind of moonshot plans to how Gaza can reconnect to its wider adjacent territories, to the sea, to the desert. But I'm sure that, I mean, once the problem of the Strip is eliminated, then Gaza can return to be what it was in the past.
So what you're saying is political settlement is really the first step towards any...
It has to be, of course.
All right. Dr. Dotan Halevy, thank you very much for this wonderful conversation. And also many thanks to Itai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios, and to the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for their generous support. Now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has probably close to 1,000 interviews by now. Like us on Facebook. Follow me and Yael on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.